Hello, my name is Alex Ars, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about the housing that the Anglo-Saxons lived in. Welcome back. So, in 1947, Edward Thurlow Leaves discovered an Anglo-Saxon structure. He dug through the ground and was horrified at what he discovered. This building probably had a triangular, almost like teepee-like roof, and then a pit into the ground, and then half buried through one of the walls was a skeleton. He concluded that the Anglo-Saxons had miserable, horrible lives living in these pit houses, and that they obviously weren't afraid of ghosts because a skeleton was halfway through the wall of this building, which later would become known as a Grubenhauser, also known sometimes as a sunken feature building. Now the funny thing is that then basically set the precedent for understanding a lot of the Anglo-Saxon world, because it was put into comparison with the Roman world. Now if you like the sound of that, why don't you subscribe now, because I think you'll enjoy a lot of the content that I have here on this channel. But let's jump right back into it and continue talking. So Leeds' discovery of this sunken feature building basically set the tone for the Anglo-Saxons. The Romans apparently lived in these wonderful villas, huge giant villas with heated underfloors, with mosaics, with plaster, with beautiful items and heating throughout the whole building. And yet the Anglo-Saxons were living in these terrible little triangular huts, living with the mud floor, packed earth floors, and they obviously didn't care at all because their skeletons were coming through. This image of the Anglo-Saxons would dog them for years until about 1976, when Ratz actually published a paper on Anglo-Saxon building structure and rural settlements, because a lot of archaeology had been conducted since the 1940s, and discoveries of large sites such as Yevering in Northumberland and also other royal palaces had really shown that the Anglo-Saxons weren't actually living in these tiny little mud huts, basically with their dead around them. They actually had complex structures, such as the building you can see behind me, which is a reconstructed building from Furlings in Northumberland that you can see at Jarrow Hall in South Tyneside. Now these sort of buildings were actually really quite impressive. They were large. They could probably hold a family, if not maybe two families, and they were communal structures in many ways, because there would also be locations for people to gather together in the centre of the village. So when you had these new structures, it caused whole new debates. Did the Anglo-Saxon building tradition come from a Germanic Anglo-Saxon building tradition, or was it a continuation of Roman Britain? And this is really quite interesting because there are 28,000 Romano-British sites discovered so far. And with that, you have to understand that a lot of these sites are on good arable land. So when the migration occurred and new Anglo-Saxon peoples came into Britain, obviously they ended up on land where there was a good chance of a previous Romano-British settlement. And so because of this, you do see an overlap. But there are very clear examples as well where there have been continuations. So at Orton Hall Farm in Peterborough, a Romano-British farmstead was actually discovered with Anglo-Saxon timber structures and Grubenhauser alongside a Romano-British farmstead, and they were continuing to work side by side together. And so there was a continuation there of both Anglo-Saxon pottery and Anglo-Saxon traditions going on there, while the Romano-British farmstead continued to be in use. So it's an interesting one there, looking at both paralleling but also seeming to be in the same community together. Alongside this as well, at West Helslerton in Yorkshire, there was discovered a Romano-British site that then continued into the Anglo-Saxon period and showed that there was a large planned and placed settlement that continued to be built and developed throughout the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries. And so you can see a continuation from the end of Roman Britain right through into what we consider the early Middle Ages and Anglo-Saxon inhabitation in the British Isles. The same could be seen at Mucking in Essex and also at West Stowe. So there are these continuations where it's not a case of these people just barged in, destroyed and then caused terror and then started building, but also a continuation from the previous Romano-British settlements, which are then added to with Anglo-Saxon halls and also the Grubenhauser as well. In a previous video, if you watch my Bamborough series, I actually was talking to someone and he said that the Grubenhauser were temporary shelters where people would live before they built a hall. The academic understanding of Grubenhausen now are that basically that they are craft sheds, or maybe possibly even weaving sheds, where people go in to use looms, to make pottery, to use other items, and to craft inside of them. And so those were the crafting sheds of the Anglo-Saxons, and they were the industrial side of any Anglo-Saxon village or settlement. Whereas the halls were the actual accommodation where families would live, cook and live together. And probably alongside this as well, the rest of your day-to-day life would actually be outside of a hall, where you would be crafting or working or possibly talking to your friends, using daylight as much as possible before returning to the hall again in the evening. One big question though is, did Anglo-Saxon building tradition originate from the longhouse tradition that can be seen in northern Germany? Now, longhouse tradition is slightly different because the long halls have rounded ends where you actually have animal pens. So the animals were kept inside, and you can also sort of see this as well within Scandinavian building tradition as well. The Anglo-Saxon hall does not have this. It is not a part of the Anglo-Saxon building tradition. So it's a really interesting one, because it's a question of the fact that when the people migrated in, were they inspired by the actual building traditions of the Romans, and so they continued building rectangular structures but with the animals kept separate? Or was there a different cultural tradition within the peoples that we call the Anglo-Saxons? And it's something that hasn't been figured out properly yet. In the Low Countries, buildings have actually been discovered that are very similar to the ones in Anglo-Saxon England, but again, the recent genetic studies have shown that the people who then occupy the location where the Netherlands would be are the same genetic group as the people who would later on become the Anglo-Saxons in England. So is it a similar cultural thing, or are we looking at something different? And that's one of the wonderful things about archaeology. Until we get some really concise data, we won't be able to actually know. Alongside this as well, there are also the Great Hall complexes, but that's another story for another day. And if you join me for another video, you'll be able to see that. So I really hope you've enjoyed today's video, as we've looked at Anglo-Saxon halls, the Grubenhausen and what they were, and basically how villages developed from the Romano-British period into the Anglo-Saxon period. If you have enjoyed, please do like and subscribe, and also share the video with your friends. And if you'd like to support me further, I do have a Patreon account and a Ko-fi account in the description below. But there is no pressure, and you don't have to if you don't want to. In the meantime though, stay safe and well, and I hope you'll join me for another video in the near future. Thank you very much.